are still on the road or still at airports making their way here. We will move after this panel to a keynote speaker of the afternoon, Professor Richard Painter, who is flown in from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who's the author of the new book right there at the back. And so he is on his way up from Logan Airport in Boston. And we will display the full amended calendar right after this panel, but we are expecting after Jim Rubens, presidential candidate Jim Gilmore. After Rubens at this panel, followed by Painter, Professor Painter, then we will go to the former Virginia governor and presidential candidate Jim Gilmore. So, Jim Rubens, a former state senator, a recent candidate for United States Senate, and we're going to introduce Brian first. Brian Tilton, a colleague of mine who I've had the pleasure of working with as our Republican Outreach Coordinator and media specialist at New Hampshire Rebellion. Brian is a longtime radio personality here in New Hampshire and down in Maryland. So he's talked all sorts of issues with all sorts of audiences and has been in particular a leading advocate on the Northern Pass Project opposition. And so, Brian, we'll ask you to take it away. Why should conservatives care about the corruption of big money special interests in politics?
All right, thank you, Dan, and it's great to be here and see the people that have made it through the challenging conditions outside, so thank you for showing up. A little bit about myself. As Dan alluded to, I'm a former radio talk show host at a show in Concord for 5.5 years before my show was abruptly ended a few weeks after Northern Pass and started to advertising on the station. So I'll just leave it at that. But a number of the reasons why I got involved in this issue was actually coming from the 2012 election cycle. And in that election cycle, I met Buddy Roemer. If you remember who Buddy Roemer was, he is the former governor of Louisiana. He was a congressman as well. And he's gotten elected to 2 terms in each office, and each time limited the amount of money that he would take in campaign contributions. Never had a super PAC, never had big dollar donors. I think the limit was somewhere around $200 or less. That was the maximum that he would take from anybody. And he was told back then, this is during the 80s when he ran for Congress. Buddy Roemer was one of the Democrats, the Reagan Democrats, who helped get Ronald Reagan's agenda through the Congress. He led that coalition on the House floor. And he was told back then, you cannot win taking that little bit of money. He proved him wrong, and then he proved him wrong again in re-election. He went on to run for governor and did the same thing. And he got elected and re-elected as governor. So in 2012, he came into my radio studio. It was actually in 2011. The primary was in 2012, and he says, Bulldog, let me tell you a story about GE, $1 billion in profits and no taxes. Well, I'm all ears, tell me all about it. So then he proceeded to explain this horrible relationship with government executives and lobbyists and how they influence legislation on Capitol Hill and everywhere else you turn. And it really opened my eyes. And as over the years, the next few years, as I started to with the eyes wide open now, started looking into things a little more critically. And then when Northern Pass came along, actually the Northern Pass was already out there because that was proposed in 2010. And I started seeing the lobbyist influence in the legislature when we were trying to get an eminent domain protection bill passed. And PSNH had 13 registered lobbyists, more lobbyists than any other business entity in the entire state of New Hampshire. And let me tell you, they sent the entire army of lobbyists to lobby the senators to not pass House Bill 648. Which provided protections against eminent domain. It says utility cannot take private property unless it's needed for system reliability. And as many people may already know, Northern Pass is not needed for system reliability. So despite all of the 1-year effort of lobbyists to get that bill killed,
I got a chance to sit down with the Senate President and said, what can we do to get this bill to finally move forward? So he says, fine, I'm going to ask every senator, I'm going to bring them into a room, just them, just me, and say, vote your conscience. You want to know what happened with that bill? It passed 23 to 1. So that can show you the difference between lobbyist influence and when you take the lobbyists out of the room, how fast something can happen. So anyway, as a conservative, and as one who has been active in conservative politics, even libertarian politics as well, this issue is really woke me up to a whole host of problems, because let's face it, whether you're Democrat or Republican, we all agree what the problem is, don't we? In any issue, you pick an issue and we all can pretty much agree. It's like Bernie Sanders, complete opposite of my political viewpoints, but he and I agree on everything that's the problem. Now what happens? How do you fix it? And this is why Republicans, conservatives in particular, because there's many conservatives who are not registered as Republicans, so let's just make that point a little clear. Why should we care about this? Because it affects every issue that you are fighting for. Somebody who says that they are a small government conservative, you cannot have small government with a bought and paid for system where you own all the politicians. It will never happen. And I even had somebody say to me, well, you've got to have government really small, so small that you can't see it. I think we heard one of our presidential candidates say that recently. And how small do you want? Because what do you want about the size of a New Hampshire small town? Oh no, there's no corruption in some of our smallest towns, is there? No! So, the point is, we can all sit and talk with each other. And this is a movement that, I don't know, it may be correctly, but I would say incorrectly labeled as a left-wing dominated issue. And it really isn't. Because when you sit and talk with people, they all realize the same thing that you and I do. There is a problem and they know what the problem is. How do we get to that solution is a whole nother thing. That's why we're here today, to hear from people who have some solutions, varying degrees of solutions, and there can be some honest disagreement. So what do? We go for the common ground issues first. I think once you reach those common ground issues, you can get a lot done. And I believe that no matter what the issue is, whether you're right or left, once you get those lobbyists out of the room, once you get the bought and paid for politicians to be able to act honestly in fundraising, then you can have a sincere debate on the issues. You've reached the common ground, fix those issues first, and then you can debate in a fair forum what your bigger issues are, and I think you can get a lot more done. So this is why it's important for everybody to be able to talk to each other like that. So that's what I have learned in the last several months that I've been working with New Hampshire Rebellion, and being able to talk with people from both sides of the aisle. One more point to this too. There were two major polls that came out a few months ago in the late summer. And one was a Bloomberg Politics poll and another was a PPP poll. They both had identical responses. Like 80-some% of people that identified themselves as Republicans were turned off by what happened after Citizens United, with the super PACs and the big spending and the lobbyists owning the politicians. That is a big progress right there, because as I have engaged every single presidential campaign, some in public, some with meetings with campaign staff, they all agree that this is a problem. The problem is they're afraid to fix it. Why? Because almost all of them, there's one guy who says he's not beholden to the big money donors, but all of them are reliant on the big money donors. So how do you convince them? That's what we've been trying to do. Showing them these poll numbers, explaining Okay, maybe you don't think Citizens United should be overturned, but let's look at these other issues that you can really get a lot more things done. And everybody agrees full transparency is one of those. Disclose every dollar of spending. Some think we should raise the limit on how much money politicians can raise, and there's certainly an argument to be made about that. But I think once you close the revolving door of lobbyists, George Pataki was one presidential candidate who suggested, you serve one day in Congress, you are banned for life from ever serving as a lobbyist again. So that's one issue. Another one said, let's have a cooling off period, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, 4 years, whatever. Okay, I think that's fair debate. And then you can have a whole lot of other issues taken right off of our pledge. So there's really a lot of common ground out there, and we are achieving that. We really are. More conservatives are getting involved in our movement, and we have some very big names that have really come forward and have, pretty much risked some political future maybe in some of that. But this is how it's going to get done, and it's because of people like you in this room is what's going to help to make it happen, and we can help make the conservatives and the Republicans understand the importance of this and why it's even beneficial to them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to former State Senator Jim Rubens.
Thank you, Brian. And for a quick introduction, I want to just underscore that thanks, because Brian has been working day and night to bird dog the candidates, often behind the scenes, going directly through his extensive contacts to engage them and to get them on record, to get them sitting down with us and talking about solutions. And as we'll detail over the course of this weekend, we have come much further than we expected to be or than we have ever been before in seeing Republican presidential candidates starting to lead on this issue. One of our probably longest-term Republican leaders on this, and one of our longest-term leaders of any stripe here in New Hampshire since at least the mid-90s, is former State Senator Jim Rubens from the Upper Valley of New Hampshire. The Tree Board of Open Democracy, he's been a crusader on a wide range of issues when not too busy as an entrepreneur and investor, and has a very unique background and perspective on this issue, and has spoken many times as part of the New Hampshire Rebellion. So please welcome former State Senator Jim Rubens.
Indeed, I got involved in this issue back in 1996. I was immersed in it. I was running for a re-election to the New Hampshire State Senate. It was a pretty easy election because I had kept my promises my first 2 years, so I was cruising along pretty well. And it was about 3 days before the election, this is the general election, and I got a $5,000 check in the mail from a woman in Chicago. Now, first of all, the campaign limit is 1,000, so that was illegal to begin with. So I said, why would someone who had never seen me, who doesn't know me, and who I don't know, from Chicago, who doesn't have any, who wouldn't have any impact on what we're doing in the New Hampshire State Senate, send me a $5,000 illegal check. So I tracked her down. It was pre-internet. I tracked her down. She was the wife of someone in the casino gambling industry. And so this is the first time I'd ever even thought about this issue of casino gambling. And you folks know that we've had a fight about casino monopolies being potentially legalized in this state over many, many years. So I tracked her down, found out her background, and I sent her check back again, and I sent it back with a letter. You have bought yourself a lifetime opponent to casino gambling monopolies in the state of New Hampshire. And so I spent, after I finished my term of office in 1998, I spent the next 10 years chairing the Granite State Coalition Against Expanded Gambling, fighting casino monopolies, and we won every single year despite being outspent 100, 1,000 to 1 by these monopolies, particularly this one in Las Vegas that wants a casino. And you got a state senator here in Manchester, by the way, he happens to be a Democrat, but that doesn't matter much, who has put in a bill to give them a monopoly this year. Watch the bill, it's right before the state senate right now. And that's crony capitalism. This is why conservatives ought to be seriously concerned about this, not just at the state level, and even if we, as Brian said, even if we shrunk Washington down to the size of Concord, you still have the same problem. We have a system wherein interest groups with money can buy election outcomes, unless, and this is the big unless that Brian talked about, unless people like in the room here, people like New Hampshire Rebellion who are fighting this issue, raising it, can mobilize the public, because we own the United States of America. This is a government of, by, and for the people of the country, unless people like us here in the room of both parties and of no party get together and say, this is the fundamental underlying problem that creates so much frustration on the right and on the left with Washington. The frustration is not driven by the fact that politicians don't know what's right and what's wrong. They know what's right and what's wrong. It's the fact they're paid to do the wrong thing. So I'm going to give you some examples in Washington that ought to mobilize conservatives. Now, conservatives have been a harder sell on this issue. This is an issue that, and I've got a lot of pushback on this over the years because I've been a proponent of small donor empowerment for many, many years. And I've been fighting for it. Thank you. So it's important, we need to persuade more conservatives to get on board in this thing and understand that this matter is why conservatives can't get policy outcomes. And I'm just going to talk about, briefly, some policy problems that ought to bug, and that do bug conservatives. Let's talk about the big one. The deficit, $19 trillion in debt. We've had the last two budget votes in late 2014, late 2015, Cromnibus in 2014. The Cromnibus, which added tens, hundreds of billions of dollars to the national debt, paid for by kids and grandkids. They can't possibly pay it now. The debt service on this is impossible. And this is fundamental to what mobilizes and motivates conservatives to be involved, is to stop crazy spending on government. And Republicans vote for this stuff in Congress. I'll give you one little example in this Cromnibus bill. There was a provision snuck in by the lobbyists for Citigroup, and you've got, those of you who follow this stuff know about this. They reinserted onto the taxpayer of the United States the downside risks of lost derivatives trades. This is something that supposedly got fixed in the Dodd-Frank bill. Well, Citigroup persuaded Congress in the Cromnibus budget bill to reinsert language written by Citicorp lobbyists. It's just about that long, maybe 50, 60 words in the budget. Another 2,000-page bill that no one reads, that appears in the seat pocket the night before, that you're ordered to vote for because the government will shut down if you don't, so that the taxpayers are back on the hook for the downside cost of bad derivatives trades. In the budget, 2015 budget, another $800 billion of debt in a single year. Shouldn't conservatives be worried about this? Well, half of the Republicans in the United States Senate voted for another $800 billion of debt being added onto our kids and grandkids. This is something that conservatives, again, for my entire life, people have been talking, Republicans have been talking about stopping crazy spending, and they can't do it. Why? Why? It's because Congress is paid to spend. The lobbyists have the power to insert the tax code. We have a 70,000-page tax code. For how long have we heard Republicans talking about a simpler tax code? My entire adult lifetime. Does it happen? No. Look what happened in the omnibus bill that was passed in December 2015. Tax breaks for racetracks. How is that in the national interest? How does that get in the budget? How do these 2,000-page bills get in the seat pocket that no one reads? Another example. Another example is, and this is something that ought to concern Republicans but doesn't. Why do you think we have the highest prescription drug prices? And Bernie Sanders talked about this last night in the debate. Why do you think we have the highest prescription drug prices in the world, in the United States? The federal government spends about $100 billion a year on prescription drugs on behalf of the public, primarily through Medicare. Okay? It's because Congress, including a lot of conservatives and Democrats, has prohibited the federal government, has prohibited Medicare from negotiating the cost of pharmaceutical drugs. It's in law. Now, should we do that for screwdrivers, for roads? Should we prohibit the federal government from negotiating or engaging in competitive bidding for products and services purchased by the government on behalf of the public? That would be absurd. It's in the law. Okay? There's another example. It drives up spending. It hastens the bankruptcy of our country. Another example would be the renewable fuel standard. Now, we saw in Iowa, the Iowa caucus that just happened, and we saw one candidate, and I've not endorsed any particular candidate yet, but we saw Ted Cruz campaigning. I think he was the only Republican, right on that, who opposed ethanol mandates.
Yes.
Which, was he the only one? Yeah, he was pretty brave. He had a blizzard of super PAC spending, dogging him everywhere he went because he doesn't want the U.S. taxpayer to subsidize a particular interest group that results in, and here's the balance on this thing, results in more starvation in Africa, higher food costs in the United States, no environmental benefit. Environmentalists don't find any benefit for the renewable fuel standard and the ethanol. It drives down our gas mileage here in New Hampshire, wears out our lawnmower and motorboat engines faster, doesn't do any good for the public at large. Conservatives ought to oppose this. Why is there only a single Republican candidate brave enough to say, stop this corporate cronyism, this insane corporate cronyism that doesn't even help the environment? Why? Because of the special interest utter distortion of our political process. Another example, regulatory complexity. We have, I'm not going to go into that detail because Republicans have all heard about this stuff. Now I'm going to shift to, as I conclude, I'm going to shift back to the debate last night. And here's something that Bernie Sanders didn't do. How many people saw the debate last night between the two Dems? A lot of folks in the room? Okay, well, Hillary came back and attacked Bernie for impugning her character as a result of her getting $200,000 plus speaking fee from Goldman Sachs. She said that, how dare you accuse me of doing anything in return for a $200,000 speaking fee? Well, here is what Bernie Sanders should have said with respect to Hillary Clinton. Okay, this is a New York Times story, so this is not me saying it's not a left-wing tinfoil, a right-wing tinfoil hat conspiracy that makes this claim. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, right? Her State Department approved the sale, and this is from a New York Times article, so it's nothing crazy. New York Times article. The State Department approved the sale of 20% of United States uranium assets to a Russian company during her term of office as Secretary of State. All right? Okay. There are serious concerns about national security when you do something like that. Okay? Now, immediately before and after the transaction, private parties to the transaction, these are parties who gained economically from the transaction that had to be approved by the United States State Department. Immediately before and after, Bill Clinton received hundreds of thousands of dollars of speaking fees from individual parties that benefited from the transaction. And the Bill and Hillary and Clinton Foundation received millions of dollars of contributions, nearly contemporaneous with the approval of this authorization of the sale of the uranium to the Russians. Okay? Now, was there provable corruption? Did the money received by the Clintons in speaking fees and Clinton Foundation grants cause the approval of the sale of U.S. uranium assets to the Russians? We can't prove that. But the Supreme Court has even ruled that the perception of a conflict of interest is a serious, degrading aspect of trust by the public in our government. When we, the public, see things like this happening, and this kind of stuff happens for the Clintons, it happens for Republicans. So I singled her out only because this was talked about last night in the debate, and Bernie should have come back and cited this particular example, because even the appearance of conflict corrodes public trust in government, and rightfully so, because we know that bought and paid for politicians on the right and left. People know that politicians who get to Washington and stay there and make careers out of it are bought and paid for. So here are a few examples that illustrate why conservatives, and the list goes on and on, it's a very long list of why conservatives ought to get involved in this issue and raise their voices and make sure that we fix the system so that we have, again, government of, by, and for the people. So I thank you folks for coming out very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. We do want to open it up for some questions. We have a few minutes left before our next speaker, Professor Richard Painter, takes the stage. Right there. Just shout it out if you would.
Really appreciate your thoughts and the fact that this is a nonpartisan issue is so unbelievably clear to people who are looking at the intellectual side of it. We talk a lot about the problem. It's the solution that is a challenge to me. And I just started something called fixitamerica.org, that essentially spent time with a whole bunch of the constitutional scholars in the country to draft a constitutional amendment that is not offensive or attacking legislators, but taking the assumption that what our legislators really want to do is do what they wanted to do at first, which is public service. So trying to get something passed that would empower them to be able to regulate money in politics and gerrymandering. But that's my attempt at a solution. I guess my question is, how do we solve it? So we can get all excited about it, but it seems to me that tangible solutions that can be passed have to be the way to go forward, or we'll be sitting in a white tent 20 years from now. So yeah, my name is Steve Lipscomb. I'm one of the many crazy people running for president in New Hampshire.
Can we give it up for Steve, by the way? There are a lot of people who put themselves out there, and we're going to hear from a few of them in the course of this weekend. But Steve, thanks for coming out, and fixitamerica.org. I do encourage you to check it out. Maybe to put a little point on the question, Jim, there are some solutions which Brian alluded to, small donor, citizen funding, which there's a lot of crossover on. Would you speak to that one?
The big hang-up, I've been traveling around the country over the past year and a half, working on behalf of Article 5 conventions. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides power by the states to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. This power granted to the states has never been used before in the history of the country. 27 amendments thus far, all drafted and proposed by Congress. They've gone back to the states. The necessary 3/4 have approved them. The second means by which amendments to the U.S. Constitution can be generated is if 34 states agree on the subject of a convention to propose amendments. If 34 states agree on the subject matter, delegates appointed by the states assemble, hash out the language of the amendment related to the subject matter of the resolutions approved by the 34 states, and then that language goes back to the states, and if 3/4 of the states, 38, approve it, that becomes a part of the U.S. Constitution. So there are basically 4 movements around the country working to use Article 5 for the first time to fix problems that a bought and paid for Congress will not fix. The balanced budget is one of them. 27 states, including New Hampshire, have approved resolutions asking for a convention, an amending convention to work on language with respect to a balanced budget. Wolfpack has been working around the country. 4 states have agreed on subject matter related to fixing campaign money corruption and creating free and fair elections. So I've been going around the country over the last year and a half trying to persuade conservatives and Republicans in legislatures to get behind that, and we've been remarkably successful. Here in New Hampshire, an Article 5 resolution related to free and fair elections passed the House and got a majority in our state Senate last year. We had a hearing on it, aggressive debate, pro and con on this question, 13-2 coming before a New Hampshire House Legislative Committee, including many, many conservatives and Republicans. So that's one thing we can do. We can use the power granted to the states to amend the Constitution. Now, we don't know what an amendment would look like to fix campaign money corruption, so that would be up to the delegates, that it would be empowered to hash this question out, and they would be fully in realization that to get any amendment passed, it would have to be massively supported by the public, because it only takes 13 states to kill any proposed amendment. It would have to be supported on the right and left. On the right, conservatives' major concern about matters pushed forward under Citizens United is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which grants people the right to speak as they wish. And my particular point of view as a conservative is the First Amendment defends millionaires and billionaires' right to speak using their money. I differ from some people on the left on this issue. That doesn't mean I don't think that millionaires and billionaires ought to control our political process, as is too close to being the case now. So solutions that could be agreed to by conservatives like myself include things like the revolving door. There are 1,300 pharmaceutical industry lobbyists in Washington. 1,300, 700 of them have passed through the revolving door. They've worked for including the past head of CMMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, is now working for the hospitals. Came out of office, working for CMS, and now works as a lobbyist for the hospitals. This is an example of the revolving door. So 700 of 30. We ought to be closing the revolving door. Conservatives agree on this. Brian talked about some other things. Transparency. We ought to know who is donating the money. Real time. Let's put it online if people are putting money into campaigns. We ought to also move money out of super PACs so that it can go directly to candidates. Super PACs can raise and spend unlimited sums of money. Candidates are limited to $2,700 per person. So instead of the money going to shady super PACs, let the money go to candidates and make sure that the public knows. And I think the single most important thing to fix the system is we need to empower small donors. And I've long been a supporter of vouchers for small donors. I'm also in favor of tax rebates for small donors. Every American pays taxes, whether it be a sales tax or a property tax or a federal income tax or a payroll tax. My view is that the first $100 of every taxpayer's money ought to go back to that taxpayer every election cycle such that they can spend that money on any candidate that they can vote for at the federal level. So you have a $100 check or rebate, could be electronic, sitting in your pocket, and the sum of money involved, if this were to happen, would be greater than the special interest money that now dominates the U.S. political system. And it would tell candidates who would voluntarily wish to foreclose themselves of big money, it would tell them they can now raise sufficient sums of money to be competitive in elections from average Americans. And instead of flying off to Aspen, Colorado and having ski vacations with lobbyists, they can instead, and I'm speaking about a particular person here, they can instead go to small donors and they can raise money and be empowered to represent the needs of average Americans. So
again, the Buddy Roemer example of the small donor limits. To Jim's 2 points, for conservatives who are who view this tax credit or voucher idea or any sort of citizen funding of elections, they say, oh no, I don't want taxpayer dollars to be used for election cycles. Well, let's take a look at what happens no matter what your solution is to it. Let's take a look at how much money these special interests are costing the taxpayers every year. So you would save a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars right away by instituting some sort of a public financing system. The revolving door of lobbyists. Here's a great image for a lot of you. Has anybody seen the movie The Big Short? Isn't that a great movie? In it, what did you see? A big party where somebody who worked for the SEC was passing resumes around to the bankers and ended up sleeping with one of them, okay? So, that's real. That happens. So, you want to talk about having some sort of reform to have those restrictions, there's another place to start.
got another question.
We have one over here too, I believe.
If we had a form of constitutional amendment that empowered public financing, small donor, perhaps a voucher system, but it did not prohibit candidates from trying to end run the system. I want to know whether you think Republicans might go along with that compromise. And before you answer, I would couple the change in the way we publicly finance the process with a whole bunch of other changes that might happen also by constitutional amendment if they didn't or couldn't happen statutorily, that basically we're going to level the playing field, put citizens in the center of the FEC, allow us to use the public airways for more free debates and change that equation, and basically do a variety of things that leveled the playing field for Republicans as well as Democrats, but did speak to the First Amendment issue by allowing you to end run it, but setting it up in a way that gave you not a lot of incentive to end run it.
Yeah, it's about the money. I think if we don't get to empowering regular citizens with sufficient sums of money so that politicians look to regular donors, small citizens with small sums of money to win elections, and not just people like Bernie Sanders who can become famous nationally, but sufficient numbers of candidates who can be competitive in all of the seats for the House and Senate. That's too many people to become famous nationally to raise money through small donors. So I think there's the potential for a grand bargain between conservatives and liberals on this issue, and the grand bargain has two pieces, and it would not require a constitutional amendment to get this done. Congress could do this tomorrow if it wished. A bill could be brought to the floor, it could be fixed tomorrow. And the grand bargain is as follows. Give candidates, take away the artificial $27 limit on campaign spending. All it does is it creates distortions. If you try to ban money in politics, you're putting your fingers in the dike. People who want to spend money buying politicians, that incentive, that motivation will never go away. No matter what you do, you can pass any number of laws. Let's understand that that's the case. Let the money go directly to the candidate in whatever sum of money the donor wishes to provide for that candidate. Disclose it in real time, online, searchably. Second piece for the grand bargain, empower small donors with a tax rebate or a voucher system so that every American who is eligible to vote gets a $100 electronic chip or piece of paper in the mail that they can spend on politicians who voluntarily, on their own, forswear big money contributions and become dependent voluntarily on small donors, Americans. I think in that is the nature of a grand bargain that Congress could do tomorrow if it wished.
I think we had a question over this way.
Anybody here? My understanding that the act in, I think it was about 2002, no, it was about 76, set up the presidential funding system. That act provided that if you took the federal funds, you could not take other funds. And what's more, it was initially suggested in that act that that applied to senators and congressmen, but that was not done. That act was successfully defended and is usable today. But why can't we just spread that act out as it was first suggested, and then those people that would take public financing would not be allowed to take money from the special interests?
Yeah, the critical problem, Ryan, the critical problem with that we've discovered in all public financing experiments is you need sufficient money so that candidates can be competitive in elections. So if you and Congress can underfund this in any one year, if you underfund those programs, candidates who want to win, and candidates do want to win, I can tell you that from having been one, you need to fund it with sufficient sums of money. Congress would have to do that every single year.
It has to be funded.
And just a note for conservatives too, Ronald Reagan took part in that public financing system, and that he used that very successfully for his victory.
Because it was properly funded.
Yeah, because it was properly funded.
Has to be properly
I
funded.
think we have another question here too.
Yes, James Madison, fourth President of the United States. Since I have returned to the modern America, I too have been very concerned about the corporate influence in modern politics. I myself am registered as a Republican. I worked hard for Charlie Baker's campaign in Massachusetts. I have enormous respect for this gentleman, and yet he has just proposed that we give General Electric $245 million out of our pockets so that they will relocate from Boston and maybe do something nice for people. But that comes out to approximately $30 for every man, woman, and child in Massachusetts. And nobody's talking about it very much. It's probably just going to float through. My estimate, having gone over the numbers, is somewhere around 1/3 to half of all tax expenditures for the U.S. government are giveaways to major corporations on our richest people. So how do we fight that one particular? Here in Massachusetts, how in the world do we convince people to stand up and tell Charlie, no, if GE wants to come here, great, they're allowed to come here, but no free money.
Keep that in mind next time someone talks about the high tax rate in Massachusetts as to why their income and sales taxes are so high. There's one example. You cut that out, you might be able to cut away one of those taxes, because we know that there have been many efforts made to repeal the income tax over the last decade or so. That's just my initial thought. Another thing too, if I can, just to dovetail off of that, and then I'll hand it over to Jim. Charlie Baker is also supporting Northern Pass because the reason why is because it would bring this large-scale hydropower, which is billed as clean, green, renewable, whatever it's supposed to be, They want to do it because of their renewable portfolio standards, these RPS. Connecticut is very much, has that system in place. The problem is with those kinds of systems, again, crony capitalism, handful of people make money in false markets that are not natural markets, and therefore it gives rise to these big hydropower projects that nobody wants to see in Canada or here, and also to those awful wind farms as well. Another example. So I just had to get that in there.
Yeah, this ties into another issue that's very near and dear to conservatives' heart, is small business and to populist art. We have this kind of tax system wherein people who can afford $1,000 an hour lobbyists, which is what it costs to have someone play at writing things to be inserted in omnibus and omnibus budget bills in Washington, pay to play is about $1,000 an hour to have such a lobbyist who can write tax code, is anti-small business, because small business people, and I've started 10 of them myself, can't afford to play in that kind of game. So when you have a crony capitalist system run on behalf of big business, you have an anti-small business economy. And small business people, I can tell you this because I'm in the business of being a small businessman right now, it's much more difficult to be a small business person in America than it was 30 years ago when I started my first one. And this is something that is near and dear to the hearts of the populace in both parties. And this is why I believe there's so much support right now for candidates like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, because there's agreement among people who are shut out of the system being those who can afford the $1,000 an hour lawyers to write tax breaks into law at the state level and at the federal level are shut out of, the small business people shut out of the process. So again, conservatives ought to be aware of this force and ought to be aware of the need to propose something, and the presidential candidates ought to be proposing something in these next few days to tell us how we're going to fix the economy so that small business can be competitive in a free market with big business that can afford to play in Washington.